For this part of the Rules Clinic, we'll discuss forward fumbles out of bounds. This year, Federation introduced a new rule regarding forward fumbles going out of bounds. Now, the rule is an exception to Rule 431, and it states that when a forward fumble goes out of bounds between the goal lines, the ball is returned to the spot of the fumble. The rule doesn't define any of these terms well, so we'll talk about some of them. The key things are to remember that the rule applies to forward fumbles. It does not apply to all fumbles or backward passes. The ball has to go out of bounds, meaning that it has to become dead out of bounds. Further, the ball has to go out of bounds between the goal lines. This rule does not apply to a ball crossing a sideline in the end zone. Finally, if a forward fumble goes out of bounds, it is returned to the spot of the fumble, which becomes the succeeding spot. So what is a forward fumble out of bounds? It's a fumble that goes out of bounds in advance of the spot of the fumble. It doesn't matter what direction the ball goes initially when it is fumbled. It doesn't matter if the ball changes direction after it's fumbled. And it doesn't matter if the fumble gets touched, muffed, batted, or kicked in different directions. The only things to compare: where the ball was fumbled and where the fumbled ball went out of bounds. If the out of bounds spot is beyond the fumble spot, it's a forward fumble out of bounds. If the out of bounds spot is at or behind the fumble spot, it's not a forward fumble out of bounds, it's a backward fumble out of bounds. Let's take a look at some diagrams to discuss that point. Here we have a runner who is hit at the B10 and fumbles, and the ball goes out of bounds at the B5. This is a forward fumble out of bounds because the out of bounds spot is beyond the spot of the fumble. In this diagram, the runner is hit at the B10, but the ball goes out of bounds at the B12. This is a backward fumble out of bounds because the out of bounds spot is behind the spot of the fumble. For this backward fumble out of bounds, the forward fumble rule does not apply. If the forward fumble goes out of bounds between the goal lines, the ball will be placed at the spot of the fumble. Looking again at our diagrams, to the diagram on the left with the forward fumble out of bounds, the ball will be returned to the B10, which is the spot of the fumble. To the diagram on the right, which is a backward fumble out of bounds, the ball will simply stay at the out of bounds spot, the B12. If the forward fumble goes out of bounds behind the goal line, this rule does not apply. The result will either be a touchback or safety, depending on who forced the ball into the end zone. So in this diagram, Team A is hit and fumbles at the B10, and the ball goes into and out of Team B's end zone. Because Team A was responsible for forcing the ball into Team B's end zone where it became dead, this is a touchback. This is not a forward fumble out of bounds. Now let's address some questions about the rule. What if the spot of the fumble is behind the neutral zone? It doesn't matter. Simply put the ball at the spot of the fumble. It's not affected by the neutral zone. What if the spot of the fumble is the offense's end zone? Return the ball to the spot of the fumble, which is in the end zone, and the result of the play is either a safety or touchback, or it could be subject to the momentum rule. What if the fumble is illegally kicked or batted before it goes out of bounds? If it's still a forward fumble out of bounds, then return the ball to the spot of the fumble, at least temporarily. The penalty enforcement for the illegal kick or bat may be from a different spot. Remember that kicks, bats, touches, or muffs do not change the status of a fumble. A fumble is a fumble until it is possessed or becomes dead by rule, just like a kick and just like a pass. What if the fumble goes out of bounds behind the spot of the fumble? As we've said, that is a backward fumble out of bounds, so the forward fumble out of bounds rule does not apply. In that situation, the ball is placed at the out of bounds spot. Let's talk about fumbles from an end zone that go forward and out of bounds in the field of play. Basically, the ball is treated as never having left the end zone. The forward fumble rule out of bounds applies, and you would return the ball to the spot of the fumble, which is in the end zone. This may be a temporary location based on the result of the play, which could be a touchback, a safety, subject to the momentum rule, or move by penalty. In these situations, it's important to know your penalty enforcement and know who forced the ball into the end zone. So what happens if Team A fumbles from its own end zone? Well, the rule still applies, and the ball is returned to the fumble spot, which is in the end zone. If Team A is responsible for forcing the ball into its own end zone, then it's a safety unless the momentum rule would apply. If Team B is responsible for forcing the ball into the end zone, then the result of the play is a touchback. Now let's talk about forward fumbles by Team B from Team B's end zone after a change of team possession. If the change of possession was in the end zone, the rule still applies, and the ball is returned to the fumble spot in the end zone. Because Team A forced the ball into Team B's end zone, the result of the play is a touchback. If the change of possession occurred in the field of play and the momentum rule is in play, the rule still applies, and the ball is returned to the fumble spot in the end zone, but because of the momentum rule, the ball will be placed at the momentum spot. If the change of possession is in the field of play and there is no momentum rule that applies, the forward fumble rule still applies, the ball is returned to the fumble spot in the end zone, and because Team B is responsible for forcing the ball into its end zone without the benefit of the momentum rule, the result of the play is a safety. When penalties occur on plays where you have forward fumbles out of bounds, enforce your penalties as normal. The forward fumble out of bounds rule doesn't affect penalty enforcement. The ball is temporarily returned to the spot of the fumble. That doesn't mean you actually have to place it at the fumble spot when there's a flag. You just have to know that's where it goes in case a coach declines the penalty. Just know your basic spots and your penalty enforcements. There is one penalty that we will enforce slightly differently than the way it's worded in the rule book because of the forward fumble out of bounds rule, and that is a penalty for roughing the passer. The rule book currently reads that you will enforce it 15 yards from the dead ball spot. When that spot is beyond the neutral zone, Team A has possession at the end of the down, and there has been no change of team possession. This is a slight overlook in the rule change that will cause inconsistency because of the forward fumble out of bounds rule. So we are going to apply the rule as if it were written this way. The penalty is enforced 15 yards from the end of the last run. When that spot is beyond the neutral zone, Team A has possession at the end of the down, and there has been no change of team possession. This allows consistent application of the forward fumble out of bounds rule on all plays, including those plays involving roughing the passer. So the penalty will always be enforced from that spot, that end of the last run, when it is beyond the neutral zone, regardless if the fumble is forward or backward out of bounds. Remember, a Team A fumble into Team B's pylon or into and out of Team B's goal line is a touchback and not a forward fumble out of bounds. In that situation, the penalty for roughing the passer is enforced from the previous spot. Next, we'll discuss mechanics for officiating the forward fumble out of bounds. The first change this year is to beanbag all fumbles. In the past, we didn't need to worry about beanbagging a fumble behind the neutral zone because there was never a penalty enforcement for that spot. Now, there's still no penalty enforcement for such a spot, but the spot may be important because of the forward fumble out of bounds rule. The beanbag will give us a reference of where the fumble was. When spotting the ball, use your normal ball rotation mechanics. Relay the ball back in to the umpire, but it will be placed at the fumble spot at the nearest hash mark. Referees, if you are wearing a microphone, this is a good opportunity to briefly explain the new rule change. It can be as simple as saying, the ball was fumbled forward and out of bounds. By rule, it is returned to the spot of the fumble, second down. The game clock will stop when the forward fumble goes out of bounds, just as any clock stops when it goes out of bounds. The difference is this year the game clock will wind and start again when the ball is spotted at the fumble spot and is made ready for play. The play clock will do what it always does. The 40-second play clock will begin when the down ends. And if the ball is spotted with less than 25 seconds on the play clock, referees just simply pump up the play clock to 25 seconds. If too much time is taken, referees, you're certainly okay then just to stop everything, put the ball on the ground, set the play clock to 25 seconds, and give a traditional chop, and then wind the game clock. Again, the rule covers fumbles that go forward and out of bounds. So what do we do with backward passes or pitches? Well, the first thing to remember is, of course, that a backward pass out of bounds is not a fumble out of bounds. Backward passes are intentional. Fumbles are not. So the forward fumble rule does not apply to a backward pass. If you have a backward pass that goes out of bounds, the succeeding spot is the out of bounds spot, even if that spot ends up forward and ahead of the spot of the pass. So what are our mechanics for backward passes out of bounds? They are what they've always been. If the backward pass is made beyond the neutral zone, drop a beanbag, not because we would return the ball there, but because that references the end of the run for penalty purposes. If the backward pass is made in or behind the neutral zone, no beanbag is needed. At the end of the down, the 40-second play clock will begin. We'll rotate the ball in and spot the ball at the out-of-bounds spot, and the game clock will start when the ball is next snapped.